Welcome to the tutorial on research. Today we are going to learn about the various types of research gaps. As you can see, there may be theoretical gap, empirical gap, methodological gap, contextual gap, practical gap, knowledge gap, population gap, and temporal gap. So these are the gaps that can be addressed through your research. Now we will learn about the details of each gap. We are going to learn about theoretical gap. Theoretical gap indicates the lack of explanatory theories. In theoretical gap, there is a gap in the existing theories or models that fail to explain certain phenomenon, certain aspects. That means whenever there is a lack of explanation on any certain fact, that kind of gap is known as theoretical gap. As for example, suppose there is a theory on consumer behavior, but if the theory is not tested in several countries to know the cultural differences, then we can say that there is a gap in the theoretical perspective because the theory is not tested in various types of phenomena. Now we are going to learn about the empirical gap. As you can see, whenever there is a lack of data or evidence in the previous studies, then that kind of gap is known as empirical gap. We can see in the empirical gap there is a lack of experimental or observational data to support or refute a hypothesis. I mean, whenever there is a lackings in the data to test the hypothesis, that kind of gap is known as empirical gap. As for example, whenever there is a limited study on the long-term effects of a new drug on a specific population, this is empirical gap. Now we are going to learn about the methodological gap, where there is a limitation in research method. As you can see in the methodological gap, there is a gap in the methods or techniques that were applied for doing the research. That means in that case, such kind of methodological gap will lead to incomplete or biased results. That's why we should reduce the gap by applying the appropriate methods by which we can generalize the findings. As for example, over reliance on qualitative methods is a methodological gap. That means since there is a scope for quantitative data analysis, whenever there are enough data to apply the quantitative analysis, then there is a possibility of gap to generalize the findings. Whenever there is a gap in the utilized method, that kind of unutilized method is known as methodological gap. Now we are going to learn about the contextual gap, where there is a lack in cross-context validation. In the contextual gap, we can see a gap arising whenever the researcher don't test the theory in various contexts. As for example, a gap arising when research findings from one context are not tested or validated in another context. Suppose you have tested one theory in developed countries, but before generalizing your findings, you have to test the same theory in the perspective of developing countries. So whenever there is a lacking in testing the theory in all the cultural context, then you can say that there is a contextual gap. Now we are going to learn about the practical gap, where there is a disconnection between the theory and practice. In the practical gap, a gap arises between the theory and practice because theoretical knowledge is not effectively applied in the real world settings. As for example, suppose you know the management theory. If you are not able to apply the management theory in the organization due to resistance, then that kind of gap is known as practical gap because theory is not tested in the practical scenario. Now we are going to discuss about the knowledge gap whenever there is a lack of understanding on certain facts. As you can see in the knowledge gap, there may be a lack of understanding or information about any specific topic or phenomenon. As for example, suppose there is a lack of research in the impact of climate change on marine diversity in polar regions. Since we are not able to reach to the polar regions frequently, that's why there may be limited study showing the impact of climate change on various areas. Now we are going to discuss about the population gap. Whenever in the research there is a exclusion of specific groups. In the population gap, maybe the researcher excludes certain populations or demographics. As for example, suppose you are doing research on a specific disease, but if you just do the experiment on the adult person by avoiding the data from the children, then that kind of lackings is known as population gap, because you are excluding the certain population in your study. Now we are going to learn about the temporal gap, which is also known as outdated research. Temporal gap arises whenever the researchers avoid the recent development or changes on any specific areas. That means the temporal gap caused by the outdated research. I mean, there is no updated research on any specific aspects. As for example, there may be lots of research on technological adoption, but if you avoid the recent technological advancement and the impact of those recent advancement on the lifestyle of people, then we can say that there is a temporal gap. I mean, there is no updated study on the recent development or changes. So these are the common research gaps you can focus whenever you are going to do any research on your field. So theoretical gap, empirical gap, methodological gap, contextual gap, practical gap, knowledge gap, population gap, and temporal gap. Whenever you are doing the literature review, you can focus on these gaps, and if you find any gap associated with these gaps, then you can pursue your research to fill the gap to ensure novel contribution through your research. Thank you.